history doesn't sleep. Welcome to History Speaks, the show where we drag a figure from the past into the present and ask them to make sense of the world we've built. This week, 5 stories that all trace back to the same fire. 1. Iran has a new supreme leader. His name is Mojtaba Khamenei, the dead leader's son. He was installed by emergency vote while bombs were still falling on Tehran. Trump called him a lightweight. Iran called it a revolution. 2. Oil crossed $100 a barrel, then $110, then briefly $120. Wall Street had its worst week in nearly a year. The word no one wanted to say is back: stagflation. 3. The G7 called an emergency summit. Finance ministers are meeting to tap their strategic oil reserves, something the world hasn't done since the 2022 Ukraine crisis. 4. Trump said, and I quote, "The war is very complete, pretty much." Iran's Revolutionary Guard called that nonsense and vowed to fight on. 5. The Dow Jones recorded its biggest weekly decline since Trump's tariff shock last April. Markets are pricing in something the White House insists isn't happening. 5 stories. 1 guest. A man who understands all of this: war, economics, succession, and the gap between what leaders say and what is actually happening. From the inside. Our guest this week was born in Corsica in 1769, the year before it became French territory, to a minor noble family. He rose through the Revolutionary Army, seized power in a coup in 1799, and by 1804 had crowned himself Emperor of the French. At his peak, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled most of continental Europe, directly or through his family. He reformed French law with the Napoleonic Code, restructured education, the banking system, and the military. He fought over 60 battles. He won most of them. He also lost, badly, when he overextended. Russia 1812, Waterloo 1815. Exiled to Saint Helena, a rock in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. What makes him fascinating for today's conversation is this: Napoleon was obsessed with the relationship between military power and economic power. He invented the Continental System, a Europe-wide blockade designed to strangle British trade. He understood that wars are won and lost in the supply chain, not just on the battlefield. Napoleon Bonaparte. Welcome to 2026.
2026. You have aircraft that can bomb a capital city from the other side of the world, and you still cannot close a strait. Let's begin.
Our first story. On the morning of March 9th, while US and Israeli strikes on Iran continued into their second week, the Iranian Assembly of Experts convened an emergency pre-dawn session. In a vote that lasted less than 2 hours, they elevated Mojtaba Khamenei, the 49-year-old son of the late supreme leader, to become Iran's third supreme leader. This was the outcome Trump explicitly tried to prevent. Days earlier, he had publicly demanded veto power over Iran's succession, saying he wanted a hand in selecting whoever came next. He called Mojtaba, who is known as a hardliner even within the hardliner camp, a lightweight. He said anyone without his personal approval wouldn't last long. Iran's answer: an emergency vote, before dawn, while the bombs were still falling. Toxic black rain has been reported in parts of Tehran following Israeli strikes on oil depots. Iran's foreign minister has called the US strikes a failure and vowed to fight as long as it takes. The Revolutionary Guard Corps has dismissed Trump's claim that the war is nearly over as, quote, nonsense. Napoleon, you know something about succession under siege, and you know what it means when an adversary installs the one candidate their enemy specifically opposed. What do you see here?
I see a message. Not a government. A message. When a nation under bombardment convenes before dawn and selects, from among all possible choices, the one man their enemy has explicitly condemned, that is not administration. That is defiance made institutional. In my time, when the Bourbons were restored to France, the Allies insisted on their own candidate. Do you know what the French people did? They cheered for me at Waterloo. Not because I had won, I had not won, but because the alternative, imposed by outsiders, was unacceptable. This is the oldest principle in the psychology of occupied peoples. Trump wanted to choose Iran's leader, the Emperor of the Americas, selecting the spiritual ruler of Persia. This tells me he does not understand the nature of the enemy he is fighting. Iran is not a government. It is a civilization that has outlasted every empire that tried to end it: the Greeks, the Arabs, the Mongols, the British, and now, it would seem, the Americans. You cannot bomb a civilization into choosing your preferred leader. You can bomb it into choosing the most defiant one it has. Mojtaba Khamenei was selected precisely because he was the choice Trump forbade. That is not a weakness. That is a declaration of war on different terms. I will tell you what concerns me most about this development. It is not that Iran has a new leader. It is that Iran has a new leader who owes his legitimacy entirely to the fact that America opposed him. He cannot negotiate now. He cannot compromise. To do so would be to betray the very basis of his authority. Your president has, in trying to dictate the succession, made peace structurally impossible. I made this error. In Spain, I imposed my brother Joseph as King of Spain. The Spanish people never accepted him. What followed was 6 years of guerrilla war that bled my Grande Armée white. La Guerre d'Espagne, the War of Spain. My ulcer, I called it. It never healed. Iran is not Spain, but the principle is identical. You cannot install legitimacy. You can only destroy it.
Our second story. Crude oil crossed $100 per barrel this week for the first time since 2022. At one point, it touched nearly $120 overnight before retreating. West Texas Intermediate was up more than 35% in a single week, the largest weekly gain in futures trading history dating back to 1983. With the Strait of Hormuz still effectively closed, major Gulf producers including the UAE and Kuwait have been forced to curb output because storage facilities have hit capacity. There is nowhere to put the oil they are pumping. At US gas stations, the national average has risen 50 cents in 1 week, the fifth largest weekly increase since the year 2000. Analysts expect it could reach $4 per gallon by the end of the week. Financial markets are beginning to price in stagflation, the combination of rising prices and slowing economic growth that is, in the view of most economists, the hardest economic condition to escape from. The volatility index, known as the VYX, spiked above 30 for the first time since last April's tariff crisis. Napoleon, you invented the most ambitious economic blockade in history, the Continental System. You tried to strangle Britain by cutting off its trade with Europe. What do you see when you look at the Strait of Hormuz?
I see the British Channel, turned inside out. In my time, Britain was the workshop of the world. Its power came not from its army, which was small, but from its trade, its ships, its credit, its navy, which was everywhere. I could not defeat Britain in battle. At Trafalgar, Nelson destroyed my fleet, so I decided to destroy its commerce instead. The Continental System. Every nation under my control, France, Spain, Italy, the German states, the Poles, the Dutch, all of them forbidden from trading with Britain. I would make the British Isles an island of poverty. It nearly worked, but it also nearly destroyed me, because blockades are two-edged instruments. When you cut off trade, you do not only damage your enemy, you damage everyone who depends on that trade, including your own allies, including your own population. My continental system made food scarce and expensive across Europe. It created a vast smuggling economy. It made my allies resent me. Russia broke from the system in 1810 because it was devastating their economy. And so I invaded Russia. You know how that ended. Now, your Strait of Hormuz. The difference is that Britain had alternatives. It could trade with its colonies, America, India, the Caribbean, it could find other markets. The modern world has no alternative to oil. Not yet. Not at the scale required. 17 million barrels per day through that strait. There is no other route. The pipelines that exist are insufficient. The strategic reserves, even if the G7 releases them, are measured in weeks, not months. Iran knows this arithmetic better than your presidents do. Here is what I find remarkable. Your economists speak of stagflation as though it is a mysterious disease. It is not. It is the natural consequence of destroying the supply of an essential commodity while simultaneously injecting fear into the markets. Rising prices, slowing activity, unemployment, rising as businesses contract. This is what I did to Britain, except I did not succeed. Iran is succeeding. And the cruelest thing about a blockade, I know this from both sides, is that it punishes the poor first, the fastest, and the hardest. The rich man fills his tank at any price. The poor man cannot drive to work. Your gasoline prices have risen 50 cents in 1 week. Watch your politics now. That is where the real war is being fought.
Our third story. As oil prices spiked, French President Emmanuel Macron announced that the G7 was prepared to dip into emergency oil stockpiles. Finance ministers from G7 nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada convened emergency meetings to discuss the coordinated release of strategic petroleum reserves. This is a significant move. The International Energy Agency's strategic reserves hold roughly 1.5 billion barrels, enough to replace roughly 90 days of total Hormuz equivalent flows if tapped at maximum rate, but they have never been deployed for this long under this kind of sustained pressure. Switzerland's defense minister stated publicly that the United States and Israel have broken international law. An explosion outside the US embassy in Oslo, Norway, has been investigated as a possible attack. Napoleon, the G7, is a coalition of the world's largest democracies. 7 nations trying to coordinate a response to a crisis that none of them individually caused. You built coalitions. You also destroyed them. What do you make of this?
A coalition of 7 nations meeting in emergency to release reserves that will last, what, 90 days? And then what? I will tell you about coalitions. I fought 7 coalitions against me. 7. And in every case, the coalition began united and ended fractured. Not because I defeated them militarily, though I did that too, but because 7 nations with 7 different interests cannot sustain agreement under pressure. Britain wanted trade, Austria wanted territory, Prussia wanted dignity, Russia wanted access to warm water ports. None of them wanted the same thing, and the moment I offered one of them a separate piece, the coalition cracked. Now, you're G7. France wishes to appear important. Britain wishes to remain relevant. Germany wishes to avoid any war that might damage its remaining industrial exports. Japan depends on Gulf oil more than any other G7 member. Nearly 90% of its crude imports pass through that strait. And America started this war alone, without consulting its allies. These 7 nations do not share interests. They share a press conference. Releasing reserves is not a strategy. It is a gesture. A strategy would answer, how does this end? Who negotiates? On what terms? What is Iran offered in exchange for reopening the strait? I notice no one is asking these questions publicly. That is because to ask them is to admit that the military operation had no exit. Macron is the most interesting figure in this group. France is not at war. France did not authorize these strikes. France is the nation that always positions itself as the potential mediator, the back channel, the diplomatic option. I am not a great admirer of French politicians who talk of peace while positioning themselves for advantage. C'est moi qui ai fait ça. I did that. It was effective. But Macron is right about one thing. The economic consequences of this war will be felt in Paris and Berlin and Tokyo before they are felt in Washington. America is self-sufficient in energy now. more or less. Its allies are not. The United States has started a war whose costs will be paid primarily by the nations that did not vote for it. This is precisely how you destroy a coalition. Not from outside, from within.
Our fourth story. On Monday, March 9th, President Trump told a CBS News reporter, in an exchange shared on social media, that the war against Iran was, quote, very complete, pretty much. He elaborated, they have no navy, no communications, they've got no air force. By Tuesday morning, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps had publicly called these statements nonsense and vowed to continue the exchange of blows. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stressed that the aftermath of Iran would be, quote, under American interests. Meanwhile, at least 1,230 people are reported dead in Iran, 300 in Lebanon, where Hezbollah is trading strikes with Israel, a dozen in Israel. 3 American service members confirmed dead, with more casualties expected. 32,000 Americans have been evacuated from the Middle East region. The markets, it should be noted, did briefly rally on Trump's comments before giving up the gains once the Revolutionary Guard's response became clear. Napoleon, you were a general. You communicated to your troops. You managed public perception of military campaigns. What do you make of a commander who declares victory while the enemy is still shooting?
I make of it this. He is speaking to his own people, not to his enemy. This is a technique I know well. In the bulletins of the Grande Armée, my official communications to France, I was not always entirely precise. After the disaster of Eylau in 1807, a brutal, inconclusive battle in winter with tens of thousands dead, I issued a bulletin describing a magnificent French victory. This was, shall we say, an embellishment. The soldiers on the ground knew the truth. The Prussians knew the truth. But the people of Paris? They celebrated. And so the phrase was born, to lie like a bulletin. Trump is issuing bulletins. The purpose is domestic. He needs his supporters to believe the operation is succeeding. He needs his markets, which are, for him, a constant gauge of approval, to not panic. He needs the next news cycle to be about something other than oil at $120. Whether the enemy agrees with his assessment is a secondary consideration. For now, here is where I will be honest about my own failures. I was also a man who confused his bulletins with his battles. I told myself stories that were convenient rather than accurate, and each story required a larger one to sustain it. By 1812, I had told so many stories, to France, to my marshals, to myself, that I genuinely believed Moscow would surrender when I arrived, that the Russians would negotiate, that winter was months away. La Grande Armée est invincible. The Grande Armée is invincible, until it isn't. I do not know what Trump actually believes. That is a genuine uncertainty. A man who has spent his entire life in a universe of his own creation, the casino, the television show, the social media, may not be able to distinguish between the bulletin and the battle. But the markets know the difference. The Revolutionary Guard knows the difference. The 32,000 Americans who had to be evacuated from the Middle East know the difference. Very complete, pretty much. I once said after Waterloo that the battle was lost by 1 hour. I did not call it very complete.
Our final story. The week of March 9th saw the Dow Jones Industrial Average record its worst weekly decline since Trump's tariff shock last April. The S&P 500's financial sector fell around 2% on Monday alone, pushing its decline for the full year 2026 to approximately 10%. Private credit giants, Ares Management, Blackstone, KKR, Apollo Global Management are down between 26 and 33% for the year. The VIX Volatility Index, sometimes called the fear gauge, spiked above 30. Veteran strategist Ed Yardeni raised the probability of a US market meltdown to 35%. JP Morgan's head of global market intelligence turned, quote, tactically bearish on US stocks. Meanwhile, Japan's Nikkei index plunged more than 5% in a single session. Global markets from Bangkok to Frankfurt are registering the shockwaves. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, has maintained it, believes the disruption will be short-lived, but has simultaneously reduced its exposure to long-term government bonds, which is itself a signal of doubt. Napoleon, you are one of the few historical figures who saw war and economics as inseparable. You created the Bank of France. You understood that money is a weapon. What do you see in these numbers?
I see the second front. War has always been fought on two fields: the military field, which everyone watches, and the economic field, which determines who can sustain fighting the longest. Britain did not defeat me by superior generalship. French generals were, in general, superior. Britain defeated me by superior credit. The Bank of England could borrow money at lower interest rates than anyone in Europe. This meant Britain could subsidize coalition after coalition against me, could pay for Prussian armies, Austrian armies, Spanish guerrillas, without going bankrupt. France could not match this. I was always short of money. Always. When I look at these numbers from your markets, the Dow, the VIX, the S&P financials down 10%. I see the economic front opening. Your Federal Reserve held rates unchanged this week. Inflation is rising due to oil. Growth is being suppressed by uncertainty. The two mandates of your central bank, stable prices and full employment, are pulling in opposite directions. This is not a financial problem. This is a strategic problem wearing a financial mask. America is paying for this war 3 times: in blood, in oil prices, and in the confidence of its markets. The blood is borne by soldiers. The oil price is borne by every citizen who fills a vehicle. And the market decline is borne by everyone who has a pension, a savings account, a retirement fund. This is the arithmetic of modern war that your politicians almost never calculate in advance. They calculate the cost of bombs, not the cost of consequences. I built the Bank of France in 1800 specifically because I understood that an emperor without credit is a general without ammunition. BlackRock says it believes the disruption will be short-lived. BlackRock is not a general. It is a banker offering reassurance because reassurance is its business. The market is saying something different. The market is saying, we do not know when this ends. Listen to the market. The market has no political interest in lying to you.
Napoleon Bonaparte, you have walked through 5 stories from a world more than 2 centuries removed from your own. Before we let you return to Saint Helena, or wherever history keeps you, is there anything you'd like to leave with our listeners?
3 things. First, a war without an exit is not a campaign. It is an occupation. And occupations always cost more than campaigns. Always. The mathematics are not mysterious. They are simply inconvenient to calculate before the first shot. Second, the economy is not separate from the war. It is the war. Every price that rises, every market that falls, every pension that shrinks, these are casualties as real as the ones on the battlefield. A leader who does not count them has not finished counting. Third, and this is the one I learned too late at the cost of everything. Genius is not enough. I was, by every reasonable measure, the most capable military and administrative mind of my era. I transformed France. I transformed Europe. I transformed the law. And I died on an island in the South Atlantic, dictating my memoirs to officers who felt sorry for me. Because I could not stop. Because I confused my capacity for victory with the justification for endless war. Because I told myself that one more campaign would settle everything. It never settles everything. The man who cannot stop is not a strong man. He is a man who has lost the ability to choose. On s'engage, et puis on voit. You engage, and then you see. That was always my motto. It was also my fatal flaw. I hope you see, before you have engaged too far to stop.
Napoleon Bonaparte. 200 years later, and still the most quotable man in the room. That is History Speaks for the week of March 9th, 2026. Next week, a new voice from across the centuries. Head to our YouTube community tab, Instagram, or X to cast your vote. If this episode made you uncomfortable, good, that's the point. History Speaks. New episodes every Friday on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen. Until next week. On s'engage, et puis on voit.